Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Energy Rev seminar on the decarbonisation of heat. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is David Elms. I'm a professor at the Warwick Business School and part of the Energy Rev consortium. I'm joined, just mentioned quickly, by colleagues for a panel to discuss the subject. We've got Dr. Madeline Morris from Imperial College, Dr. Jeff Hardy from Imperial 2, and then we're also really thrilled that Caroline Bragg, who's the Director for Policy and Research at the Association for Decentralised Energy, joining us too. We had hoped that Will Humphreys, who's the Director of Policy and Research, who's the Head of Strategy Implementation at BEIS, would have joined us. He's unfortunately gone into hospital for an operation, and so we really wish him a swift recovery. So I'll sort of introduce the session with a few sort of practicalities. I'll then hand over to Jeff and Madeline to talk us through the report. We'll ask for some initial sort of views and thoughts about the report from Caroline, but we're intending to leave about half or just under half of the session for your questions. So my request up front is please use the Q&A box to put your questions in. There's also an upvoting facility so that you can put your question to the front or put a question to the front that you want to hear the answer. And please do put the question in as you go along. Often it's the ones that sort of put in early get the most votes and so get covered. The practicalities are that Energy Rev is a research consortium of about 50 researchers from 22 universities across the UK. And what we're looking at is the role of smart local energy systems, the role that they can play in a net zero future. The consortium was created as part of the government's Prospering from the Energy Revolution programme, initially part of the government's industrial strategy. And the purpose of Energy Rev is both to provide some academic insights around the challenges and the opportunities, and also learn from a whole portfolio of projects and demonstrators that are happening within the PIFA programme. Now, this seminar is one of our series on government insights that we're holding at a sort of lunchtime seminars. And the purpose is to sort of draw upon our understanding from across the consortium to ask that question about sort of policy, government regulation. Now, we've particularly in these reports tried not to sort of get too involved in individual technology selection. We can chat about that, welcome to do so. But we wanted to try and sort of step back and be a little bit sort of technology and agnostic regarding the question of, well, have we got the policies and the regulation and so on in place, whatever the technology that's chosen. It's the fourth such seminar in this series. The others are on the Energy Rev website if you'd like to look at them. And please do sign up for further events on Energy Rev. We are recording this event and it will be available afterwards. Please, as I said, use the Q&A box to put your questions in and to vote them. And otherwise, once again, thank you very much for joining us. And I'll hand over to Jeff in terms of an opening look at the report.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. So Madeline and I are going to tag team this presentation, so I'm going to start and finish and Maddie's going to do all the hard work in the middle. So David's already said that the actual report, along with a very accessible blog, are on the Energy Rev website. We're going to present the highlights today. So if you want to read the detail, then go and look at the 60-page report at your leisure. Can I have the next slide, please, Maddie? So this is the team that delivered the report. So we are, as David says, part of the Energy Revolution Research Consortium, and we lead the work in the consortium on policy, regulation, markets and governance of smart local energy systems. A couple of important points. One, we're a very smiley team, as you can see from this. But second, our overarching research question, the thing that we're really interested in here is, do we have the appropriate framework to realise the benefits of smart local energy systems? That's what we're looking at across our work. And this report is part of the evidence base for that. Next slide, please, Maddie. This is our third report in our policy and regulatory landscape review series. These are all systematic reviews. Each topic is something that those prospering from the energy revolution projects have in common. So either electricity storage, electric vehicles, digital energy platforms, and today's project on heat. And the purpose of these is to understand what the current policy and regulatory landscape is and what the opportunities and barriers are for these smart local energy systems. Next slide, please. Now, why heat? This is an audience that I think I really don't need to explain this to, but the graph that we have on the right of this slide, which is from Dr. Grant Wilson at the University of Birmingham, really helps put it in context for me. So it's the three major kind of like energy vectors here. You've got electricity demand in red, you've got liquid transport fuels in kind of black and the up and downy line, and then you've got the blue gas exports, or the gas use minus exports. And what this is showing is that in winter, gas use for heating in particular, but all of the other uses we use gas for, industrial processes, chemistry, all sorts of things, is the largest source of energy use and energy demand in the UK, and it's seasonal. It's a lot different in summer than it is winter. Big challenges. There's facts and figures over on the left of this slide, but there's just a couple of things to pull out. So one is, compared to electricity in transport, heat has seen less decarbonisation progress, and it's rather siloed as a separate heat problem in regulation, policy, etc. Secondly, it's intrinsically linked with societal issues and impacts, and it makes it much more than a technical challenge to decarbonise heat. And in fact, without significant changes, the transition is likely to exacerbate social inequalities. So you've probably all seen the gas crisis we have at the moment, the emphasis that puts on prices, with the price cap being raised in April. National Energy Action are suggesting that that is going to push an additional 2 million people, so 6 million people in total, into fuel poverty from April. And there is another price rise baked in October as well. So decarbonisation of heat is both a systemic and a wicked problem. And a wicked problem is because it's socially complex, stakeholders have got different versions of the truth, the problem, the solution. No single organisation holds the key to it, and there are many interdependencies. Next slide, please. So why a smart and local approach? Well, the local bit's easy. Heat is generated close to demand in homes, businesses, schools, community. It is inherently local. However, the approach that government's been taken has mostly approached heat decarbonisation as a siloed national issue with top-down strategies. The second part is that heat will need to be, but isn't at the moment, smart. And this is to manage both short-term kind of like fluctuations, demand for heat, and the implications for the rest of the energy system, but also the fact that it's an interseasonal issue, you know, winter, summer. And this is going to be especially problematic or challenging in a more electricity-driven future. It's a system challenge as well, because heat is going to have to be integrated into a system which has got much more variable output renewable electricity, electric vehicles, lots of other things going on as well. So unlocking the demand side and the flexibility inherent in that is going to be absolutely key. So what our review was trying to do was to understand what the policy, regulation and market structures in the UK for heat are at the moment, and then use evidence to identify the gaps, barriers to the emergence and success of smart local energy systems. And I'm going to hand over to Maddie now, who's going to take us through the process and the findings. And you're on mute, Maddie.
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, so we used the same rigorous systematic review process as we did for the previous reports in this review series. You can read the full methodology in the report, but basically we systematically searched for all the literature that we felt was relevant here, and then we put it through a rigorous review process, and we categorised it into emerging themes, and this process is known as an inductive coding method. By that I just mean that we let the themes emerge from the literature rather than going in and looking for specific things. And so through doing that, what we found was that a lot of the issues that were coming up, we class as cross-cutting issues, and that means that they're not technology specific. And so as David said, this is not a technology specific or technology focused report. We're also aware that there's a lot of really great work that is coming out looking at the specific technology barriers and ways to get over them. So for example, one from our colleagues at the Energy Futures Lab at Imperial College London, which was out a couple of weeks ago, that looks at specifically heat pumps and hydrogen. So instead, in this report, we're focusing on the cross-cutting barriers that we identified, because if we address these barriers, we could unlock multiple decarbonisation pathways in heat. We also then looked for evidence of where smart and local approaches were already being adopted. And we found that whilst there's quite a bit of evidence for kind of either a smart or a local approach to this problem, there wasn't very much action that we found that we would class as smart and local. And so there's lots of potential that we could gain there. And so in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to summarise what the cross-cutting barriers are and look at how a smart local energy systems approach could address these barriers. And then I'll pass back to Jeff, who'll look at, sort of compare that to what government strategies are doing and look at where there's any missed opportunities. So what are the barriers? Well, we found 5 really. They are information, engagement and behaviour, strategy, policy and regulation, infrastructure, supply chain and skills, and then distribution of costs and impacts. And I think an important thing to note is that these barriers are not unrelated. In fact, that we found that they very much intersect with each other and they often exacerbate each other. And I'll give some examples of where that happens. So when it comes to information engagement and behaviours, it's well accepted that some behaviour changes, drastic or not, are going to be needed at a household and individual level to decarbonise heat. So whether that's kind of a one-off decision about energy efficiency upgrades to homes or deciding what to switch your technology to, or whether that's longer term changes in how we use heat and interact with our heating systems. We do not know enough currently about how to engage with people on heat decarbonisation. We're well behind the power sector in our understanding of how to effectively engage with consumers. What we do know is that public awareness of the need to do something about heat in homes is low. Awareness of alternatives to fossil gas boilers is even lower, and there are issues, real and perceived, with existing zero carbon heat technology offerings. And this means that there's trust and acceptability issues with the public. We also know that information alone is not enough to induce behaviour change, at least not at the scale and pace that we need it to. And so we need better methods of inducing rapid change. On policy, strategy and regulation, successive governments in the UK haven't put in place the robust long-term strategies for heat decarbonisation that integrate with the rest of the energy system. As Jeff said, heat has been treated largely as a kind of separate problem. Regulation has been inconsistent, for example, with heat networks having been historically unregulated, and policy has been really stop-start and fragmented, particularly when it comes to building energy efficiency. This has left consumers at risk, and it's left us with a thermally inefficient building stock, coupled with one of the highest reliances on gas for heating in Europe. The cross-cutting issues relating to infrastructure challenges for delivering net zero heat broadly fell into 3 categories that we framed as questions here. How are we going to repurpose existing infrastructure like the gas network? How much of the same infrastructure like electricity generation is going to be needed, and where do we need to build that? And then how can we overcome issues with existing infrastructure like our old, inefficient, drafty and very heterogeneous building stock? And there's also there's tensions between accommodating new infrastructure like heat networks, for example, and then the presence of existing infrastructure like electricity, gas and telecoms networks that can sometimes get in the way. Without a clear long-term strategy, these questions are really difficult to answer, and there's a risk of technology lock-in to infrastructure that is perhaps more expensive and less efficient than it should be. On supply chain and skills, the UK doesn't currently have the capacity to deliver the millions of energy efficiency upgrades and heating installations that we need over the next 3 decades or less than. We need to build strong supply chains and provide training opportunities to both new and existing workers across the sector. And we also need innovative business models that could help to take away some of the consumer risk and uncertainty. But businesses need long-term strategies, they need certainty to be able to invest in new skills and business models. And there's issues with current licensing and arrangements, which are providing a barrier to innovation. Ofgem has recognised this and they're looking to address it. And then on distribution of costs and impacts, the transition is going to incur costs. There's currently a high level of uncertainty about how these costs should be distributed. Of course, the relative costs of gas and electricity are skewed at the moment because social and environmental policies are levied disproportionately onto electricity bills. And co-impacts aren't fully appreciated in evaluations of decarbonisation pathways. And when I say co-impacts, I mean the health impacts, the economic impacts of currently using fossil fuel heating and of living in poorly insulated homes. And the negative impacts already disproportionately impact or affect those who are in or at risk of fuel poverty. And what this means is that without a pretty major redistribution of costs, decarbonisation on current trajectories will be slow and it is likely to exacerbate fuel poverty. And we won't be able to capture the potential health and other societal benefits that could come if we did this transition in a fair way. So that brings me to what we call the SLES Prism. And we first introduced the concept in our report on how smart local energy systems could contribute to post-pandemic economic recovery measures. And what we did here is we identified what we saw as the 6 key elements of a smart local energy systems or SLES approach. And we used that as a framework to assess how you could essentially get more bang for your buck in economic recovery. And those key elements were local knowledge that's held by local actors, trust and the ability to engage with different groups, coordinated approaches to planning, alignment with local economic plans, the ability to capture local co-benefits of investment, and the opportunities for scale-up and replicability of solutions. And so again, in this report, we used this SLES Prism to explore how this smart local energy systems approach can help to overcome each of the 5 cross-cutting barriers that we identified. So first up, again, information engagement and behaviour. Well, we can draw on the local knowledge of trusted actors like businesses and local authorities and community groups, and that could facilitate really effective engagement between citizens, consumers, and then also national actors to develop that understanding that we're currently lacking about the needs and the priorities and the drivers here. Smart business models, things like heat as a service, could avoid the need for some of the behavioural changes that are identified, or create new social practices by transferring some of that risk and responsibility away from consumers. And that might reduce some of the hesitancy that people have. And approaches that centre local societal co-benefits like health, alleviation of fuel poverty, job creation, they are likely to be stronger and more acceptable to the public than plans that are purely positioned as just an environmental movement. On strategy, policy and regulation, a SLES approach could aid the development of coordinated plans which align heat decarbonisation strategies with existing goals of local authorities and with statutory duties. And there's already been a demonstrated desire to do that, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. Smart place-based approaches, like SLES approaches, are projected to be cheaper than national plans. That local knowledge of the regions is key to creating a strategy that will allow the delivery of zero carbon heating. Local knowledge, again, and coordinated planning could also help to determine which pathway is most suited for a community or a region, given its resources, but also its priorities, in a way that integrates it across the whole of the energy system. Existing local engagement and trust channels that are currently sitting with local actors could help to communicate these decisions and measures effectively. And this approach could help to support and inform national decisions on how to answer those questions we have about infrastructure, like what do we do with the old infrastructure and where do we put new infrastructure. And then because it's likely that there will be regional variations in what solutions are most appropriate for a certain area, supply chains are going to need to be developed locally. Taking advantage of local knowledge of assets and of opportunities and needs could help to align the heat decarbonisation efforts with local economic strategies to develop skills and training opportunities and create jobs where jobs are really, really needed. And local leaders are really best placed to coordinate these efforts. And local authorities can leverage their purchasing powers to catalyse that scale up and strengthening of supply chains. And then finally, on the distribution of costs and impacts, well, for a start, the SLES approach is projected to lower the overall costs of decarbonisation versus these top-down national approaches. There are lots of societal co-benefits that could come with a transformation of the heat sector, but importantly, these are not guaranteed, and we're at risk of losing out on these benefits if we prioritise a top-down national approach. And local actors are again ideally placed to not only identify which benefits are most urgently needed, but also to capture, also to develop the plans, the smart plans that will enable multiple benefits to be captured. And so now I'm going to hand back to Jeff, who's going to take you through our look at the government strategies and how they compare with our propositions here.
Wonderful, thank you, Maddie. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the main findings of the report. So we were fortunate, I guess is the word, to be doing our research at the same time as both the UK and the Scottish governments published their heat and building strategies. So this allowed us to explore our barriers and the role of smart local energy systems against the proposals that were out there. So I'm going to walk through these, but I'm going to say at a high level, it appears that the Scottish government better understands the role of smart local energy systems and local actors in delivering its heat and building strategy. I think that's quite apparent from the two strategies. There's a lot more detail in the report as well on each of these measures. So what I'm doing here is a very high level read through. But if we once again look at those 5 cross-cutting barriers, in terms of information, engagement and behaviours, then there aren't really any major announcements in the UK strategy. There's a recognition that all of these things are really important, but not a lot of action. In Scotland, on the other hand, there is a national public energy agency that's going to be launched that addresses in part these issues. On strategy, policy and regulation, there's a recognition of the role of local authorities, but no actual additional duties in the UK heat and building strategy. In Scotland, there is a proposal for a statutory duty on all local authorities to develop these local heat and energy efficiency plans. In both cases, there's action on new home standards, zero carbon standards, and also signalling of fossil fuel bans, although nothing yet in place. In terms of infrastructure, both strategies support heat networks and continue support for heat networks. Decisions on hydrogen, particularly in blending and gas networks, is a referred matter, so that's for UK to take, and that is going to be decided for hydrogen and heating by 2026. On supply chain and skills, then there will be supply chain and skills action plans coming out in 2022, so we don't know what they're going to say, but at least it's coming, so we should see some action in those places. And then on distribution of costs and impacts, well, in the UK there's a focus on innovation and supply chain to drive down costs, plus some boiler replacement grants. So, there's a large target for, say, up to about 600,000 heat pumps a year by 2028, I think it is off the top of my head. But in the strategy itself, the maximum support is 30,000 per year. So 90,000 across the course of the strategy, as I recall. So there's a gap. So there's a lot of emphasis on the supply chain to deliver and business to deliver in there. In Scotland, there are interest-free loans for heat and energy efficiency. There's also some decisions on shifting policy costs from electricity to gas coming this year from the UK. These are alongside all of the other measures that were announced by the Treasury recently on helping offset the costs of the price cap rise in April. But we don't know exactly what's going to be on the table there when we come to that, or when the decision will be taken to move policy costs. Last slide, please, Maddie. So in terms of recommendations, the way we've split these out of the report is recommendations for central government, which could be also devolved administrations, recommendations for local government, and then a recommendation for Ofgem. So in terms of central government, the first two are probably really quite important. So one is that we need some certainty and we need some long-term strategy. And this strategy has to be whole systems vision for decarbonisation of heat that's going to help give this certainty to supply chains. Also, we need some key decisions. So these key decisions, and we need them as soon as possible. And these key decisions could be on things like national infrastructure. So to what extent are we going to have a gas network in the future, for example, and where, and what gas is going to be in it? There are other things that are also really important, and a lot of these, the next one relates to a big decision, which is we think we need to have more powers devolved, more powers and responsibilities devolved to local government, and I'll come on to those in a second. But if that is going to be true, then we also need to have a mechanism to ensure that local authorities have the resources and capabilities commensurate with delivering on these powers and responsibilities, commensurate with their own net zero ambitions as well. Government has already announced that it is going to take, or has taken a decision to bring heat network regulation under Ofgem's remit, but that has not actually happened yet. So heat networks sit in a different regulatory environment to, say, gas or electricity heating. And this review of societal and environmental impacts and how they're reflected in policy costs really needs to be completed very quickly and implemented. Ideally with a view to accelerating as fast as is possible decarbonisation of heat and improving energy efficiency in buildings. So in terms of devolving powers to local government, now it's really important to say that whilst we focus on local government as a key actor here, it's not the only actor, but we see local government as a way of really being a coordinating force for all of the local actors that are going to deliver on local heat and energy efficiency plans and implementation. You know, so they really do, as per the SLES Prism that Maddie presented earlier, they are a key part of that and a key coordinating power. But the sorts of things that we're talking about here is that local authorities should be responsible for ensuring energy efficiency of buildings in existing and new buildings, and that being commensurate with net zero targets. We think they should be required to engage businesses and consumers in net zero so that the values, preferences and needs of communities are built into local net zero plans. We think that local authorities could and should be mandated to work with network companies and system operators, so electricity and gas networks and other networks, on strategic infrastructure needs, as well as kind of like having this really strong link with the local economic plans. We think that central government should disperse and devolve the responsibility for coordinating grant funding, such as energy efficiency grant funding, down to local authorities. And that has actually been proven to be quite successful in the somewhat less successful Green Home Grant scheme that was recently. The actual local authority-led bit is relatively successful compared to the other scheme. Local authorities should also be having a really important role in coordinating the skills and training provisions for heat decarbonisation and energy efficiency locally. And then the final recommendation is one for Ofgem, and it's really to try and speed up business model innovation, to start to deliver some of those models that Maddie started to talk about earlier, so heat as a service and other things. So what we're talking about here is putting in place a innovation space at a regional or local level that allows companies to try these new, much more user-centered business models that could really deliver zero carbon heat and energy efficiency much quicker, and to try things, to experiment, to fail fast and to learn. And then to kind of like be allowed to go and deliver on successful models thereafter, as opposed to kind of like stop them at the end of a trial. So we think it's really important that that space for business model innovation is created as well. And at that point, I'm going to stop and hand back to David, roughly on time.
So thanks very much, Maddie and Jeff, for giving us an overview of the report. What I'd like to do now is, first of all, introduce or let Caroline introduce herself. And really, Caroline, I'm keen to understand, what's hot about heat. It does feel that heat is finally getting a bit of attention. Some of the key things, I mean, I'm in a business school, we read the FT, and there was recently an opinion piece about, Europe must get serious about renovating homes to ease the energy crisis in the FT. If you could just introduce yourself, a bit about your perspective and some of the things that are going on, and then we'll pick up the conversation about the report.
Great, fantastic, and thank you so much for having me. So at the Association for Decentralised Energy, we represent a number of sectors, but principally for this discussion, those include energy efficiency, flexibility, heat networks, and broader heat decarbonisation. I guess the big things that we are focused a lot on is last year we had, as just been saying, a huge amount of strategies coming out of government, but they left some big gaps, and there is also now a question about where delivery of some of those commitments goes. I think the first thing I would say is, as has been kind of said before, is that the heating building strategy was relatively weak on anything new in terms of the government's approach to energy efficiency retrofit, but it did trail huge amounts of work that they are committing to do this year. I guess the question at the minute is whether that actually comes to anything. The second thing I think is that when we look at the heat decarb side, we've got some really big reforms that are coming and have now been launched. So if you look at heat network side, as Jeff was saying, we've got regulation. We've also got policy in terms of introducing heat network zoning starting to be developed. And on the heat pump side, obviously one of the big things that also came out was the announcement on fossil fuel phase out on the off gas grid sector. But I think there's a real question there in terms of, whilst we've got a little bit of clarity now in terms of the short term to perhaps the middle of this decade, it's still really not very clear where we are going in terms of how we get to mass shift towards decarbonised heating in the latter part of this decade. I think then finally, very briefly, obviously all of this discussion and probably the rest of the discussion for this year is now within the context of a sector-wide crisis from the prices we're seeing in the gas market. I think on our side there are two parts to that are quite important. There is the immediate impact on consumers, on our ability to mitigate that, but also continue to move forward in what we were trying to do in terms of rollout and expansion. But I think then more than that, there are bigger questions that it provokes. As you said, there's a question about where the political debate goes on this, whether it supports it or it doesn't, and then whether it acts as a spur to accelerating the really big reforms that we need, or whether it actually retrenches us.
Thank you very much for that. And I suppose looking at the report, some comments about what's in there, what wasn't in there, and I'll use that to sort of take us into the questions, if I may. So yeah, please do post your questions online, because I'll go straight into those next.
Perfect. Yeah, so I think I guess the things that I felt really compelling in the report, I think the value of having a smart local energy system with respect to both the local conditions on the ground and obviously as someone who's involved in heat networks, the ability to make use of waste heat effectively is a really important part of that. I think the other thing that came out really strongly in the report and was very compelling was the broader understanding of co-benefits and what we want to achieve through doing this. So not just looking at it from the economic or a decarbonisation perspective, but the broader benefits that actually taking a much more regional, local approach could bring. I thought that was a really compelling part of it. I think it was really nice as well to see the balance and the breadth of the report with respect to kind of individual dwelling solutions with heat pumps, for example, the role of heat networks and the really important role of energy efficiency and then flexibility. I thought that achieved a really nice balance actually that was very persuasive. It also asked some really meaty questions, which I'm sure we'll get into in the debate, and particularly how we reverse, you know, what are decade-long trends in terms of stop-start approaches to energy efficiency retrofit and a centralised approach to energy policy in a really meaningful way, which I'm sure we can take forward into the discussion. I guess just in terms of further, I guess, provocative comments to get discussion going. I think there were kind of three things that stood out for me as areas where it'd be really good to explore in a bit more detail. I think the first is that, you know, as Jeff mentioned briefly, regional governance is complicated. There are different tiers of local authorities with different types of responsibilities, duties and capacity. And we've also got newer actors emerging. So, you know, we've got the question of what the mayoral authorities will do, whether we'll see an expansion there. We've got a question about actors such as local enterprise partnerships, what their role is, local energy community hubs, for example, all these types of actors, which I think it would be good to explore in a bit more detail about the role that they play. The second thing I wanted to note was that I think whilst there was a really strong emphasis on the reform that we needed to really pick up some pace here, I think we need more radical thinking on how we get to a point where we have sustainable, massive upscaling of the shift to heat pumps at a kind of individual dwelling level, as well as a really significant deployment of heat network infrastructure in this decade. We need more on that. I think on the other side as well, if we're really going to make this work at a local level, we need to think more carefully, I think, about the electricity system and the way it incentivizes particularly regional balancing. And then I guess just very finally, I think the other thing that kind of stood out a bit is that particularly from our side, we feel that on the energy efficiency side and on the heat decarb side, there's going to be a real need for green finance and private finance to be getting involved alongside subsidy support from central government or from local government. And I think the question of how the role of local authorities and the role of smart local energy systems in directing some of that massive amount of capital investment at a local level is something that we can explore further too.
Thank you very much indeed. What I'd like to do, you had three questions there, sort of regional, radical pace and money. So I'm going to sort of pick some of the questions that have come up and suggest that we chat about that. Jeff, Maddie, be really keen to hear your thoughts as well. So Jan Webb's invented a fantastic new word called dumpting, which is this idea, but she's raised a really important point, which you just said, which is, well, it's all very well to sort of delegate this down, but to who, where, how? So have you got any thoughts about it? I know I've got a couple of thoughts about it, but I'll let other people sort of get going. So this whole delegation, yeah, that's a nice and easy thing to say, but, you know, come on.
I can start, David. I'm very happy to. I actually want to hear Caroline's thoughts on this as well, because I know ADA, you've done some thinking in this space as well. So yes, you can read our recommendations as a bit of a kind of, you know, give a load more responsibilities and pain and headaches to local authorities. And it's not quite meaning it like that. It's basically saying that actually local authorities are these naturally coordinating, trusted ability to kind of like get that collaboration going on a local level, do this economic planning, do this strategic thinking. But as we know at the same time, you know, they've been hollowed out over the past decade and more. Budgets are being cut. There's been a lot of choice between like focus on different priorities, you know, within the constraints of budget. So some are better placed on energy than others, for example, for all sorts of regions, and they come in lots of different shapes and sizes, capabilities, kind of budget resources, all that kind of thing. So the key point I want people to take away from is this idea that with great power and responsibility needs to come commensurate budget and capability, you know, and that has to be, you know, in the UK, we know we have one of the most centrally controlled budgets, you know, around. There is a very great deal of centralisation in the way we do things. It's why we do a top-down approach quite often. I think we're basically saying that needs to quite radically change. So if we're talking about radical things, then there is a rebalance of where the responsibilities and the resources lie in the UK. I think that's ultimately it, because if it's just responsibility, then it is going to get in the same amount of trouble with kind of like capabilities and the resources to deliver on that.
Yeah, I think I'll just add quickly to that. We, as Jeff said, we do go into it a bit more in the report, and it's an excellent point. And we picked through, I think the Citizens Advice did a really good report that talked about the risk of the postcode lottery, and that unless all local authorities are doing this, or regions, then we might have pockets of the UK that are doing this really well and people benefit, and that might be at a detriment to the next door town, for example. And so I think this is where the Scottish and the UK governments have taken a very different strategy. And the Scottish Government have announced that they will put in a statutory duty for all local authorities to develop local heat and energy efficiency strategies, I think it is. But on the other hand, the UK government, I think it's either in the heat and building strategy or in the net zero strategy, basically ruled out putting a statutory duty onto local authorities. And so unless there is an alternative strategic role coming in there, then that is absolutely a risk. As Jeff says, you can't expect local authorities to do all the work without giving them this support. And at the moment, we're definitely at risk of that.
Yeah.
But I suppose sorry, Karen.
Oh no, the only thing I was going to say is I think where the Scottish Government got to on that question, even further than that, right, got them into more interesting places than perhaps we are with the UK government right now, because you could see with respect to both LHEs as well as the heat network legislation that was put in place with Scottish Government, the fact that duties were imposed on local authorities meant that there was now an agreement between central government and local government to actually put together a proper strategy for how local authorities will be resourced and have the capacity in order to do this, which at least takes you forward a little bit, right, in terms of starting to approach this in a more structured way.
I suppose I'd be slightly more provocative still, which is, there is the sort of gap between, well, okay, we'll support 90,000 heat pumps, but we want to try and get to 600,000 a year. Yeah, that's a gap that's not going to get covered easily. I suppose what part of Energy Rev and the way that we play the role we do within the overall Prospering from the Energy Revolution programme is we do look at the demonstrators and the design projects and so on, who are all trying to make smart local energy systems. And it's fascinating to see what some of them are doing. Some of them think that addressing heat is just putting a couple of heat pumps in. Other ones actually really do incorporate heat in a smart, integrated, flexible way, which I think leads on to the radical at pace question, which is, how can we get more local energy systems into that smart, flexible, integrated, radical approach that is necessary? And I do feel that the PIFA program overall has got some really good examples, and perhaps we direct some of the effort and support to those programs which have already taken that path. But any wider comments from the panel about the radicalness? And I'll probably pick up the question there about regulatory sandbox. Jeff, you might want to cover that one. Is do you need sort of changes in regulatory environment to be radical at pace?
Yeah, I'm happy to start with that. I think if I just put a high level comment to the main question, David, then at the moment we have an energy system that doesn't really reward local actions that do any of the things that local actions can do. They can sort out grid constraints, they can reduce balancing issues, they can maximize the utility of local renewables, which are close to demand, which means you're not using as much of the network, all of those kind of things. Very difficult to pass all of those benefits back locally because of the way in which all of our markets work, actually. So getting those sorts of financial incentives in place to do the right thing locally is probably one part of a wider thing. On the regulatory sandbox, and it was a good question on that from Rufus. I think it's right. It's kind of like, I don't think I'm talking about the typical sandbox approach at the moment, which is whereby as a project, I go to Ofgem and say regulations 1, 2, and 3 really don't work for me. Can I turn them off in a kind of like a very specific and limited way so that I can try something? And then at the end of it, they have to turn back on again, broadly speaking. So it's kind of, I try something, I demonstrate it's brilliant, and then I can't do it anymore. What I think I'm talking about here is like almost like permanent derogations, which are identified, so derogation to turning off these rules, permanent derogations that are specific to the needs of a local area or a region. You know, it's basically the sorts of things we have identified in our economic plans, in our energy strategy, tell us that we're going to need these sorts of business models like energy as a service, heat as a service, peer-to-peer energy, whatever it might be. Can we have derogations that allow those to happen and stay, you know, if they're working, you know, if they hit whatever kind of metrics we're going to measure them on? That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. So that's a much more adult conversation between a local area or a region with the regulator, then agrees a kind of like a set of kind of like derogations in a place. It's a very similar recommendation to what came through a deep dive on renewables in Wales, led by the Deputy Climate Minister, that I was involved in. Actually, I'm not surprised it's similar now I think about it. Anyway, so yeah, so it's that idea, you know, can you impose that kind of like that space for innovation at a regional or local level in a way that's not necessarily time limited, so that you can have that rapid innovation and learn stuff and fail where you can learn from failure, fail fast. So yeah, I'll stop there because there's loads of other stuff that I'm sure other people want to talk about.
Can I add in the point that sort of says it goes to the co-benefits and the fairness aspect of smart local energy systems? You know, there's comments about, well, the danger is that it'll be more wealthy individuals who get the money to install the heat pumps and so on. So I am going to sort of push you all on saying, yeah, it's all very well to sort of say, well, let's devolve it locally, but who to?
Shall I? I can add some thoughts, I guess. I think I guess the thing is, I think there's something quite interesting about and more to explore with this question of either the able to pay market and also the impact of the transition on people who might be in fuel poverty, which is part of this question. So if you'll bear with me just for a moment, I think firstly on the able to pay side, I guess what we feel at the minute is that sort of segment of the market, we don't understand it as much as we need to. So a lot of this discussion often, for example, is how far do households have the ability to pay the upfront capital cost? For example, very few. But I think there's more than that, which is if, for example, we start looking at types of loans, for example, you know, a lot of the green finance stuff goes in that direction. What are the different kind of what's people's different access to credit, for example, and that type of financing, which we need to understand a lot more as well. I think more than that as well, I think if you look at, for example, where we've been on energy efficiency, which as we've just talked about, has been really quite really difficult politically, particularly in the owner-occupier sector. It's been better in the social housing sector, you know, and we're in a position where actually, on average, building performance standards have outperformed the broader housing market in that sector. And I think getting back to the point that was made in the report about the collective purchasing power of the local authorities and their ability to act on their own estate, I think there's a really interesting question about actually how would you do this in a way that's fair, both in terms of that upfront capex and the ongoing costs, but using some of the power that the local authorities bring in being able to do big amounts of change for many people. I think that could be a really interesting part of this discussion that we sometimes don't focus on perhaps as much as we should.
I think the money side of it's, you know, moving on to your third point, Caroline, about the money side of it. I mean, you've addressed some of it, and I suppose my argument is, yeah, try and work out where you can put the money focused so that we make the rapid progress at scale, and that's radical as well. Certainly the work we're doing here at the University of Warwick looks at the campus as an energy system and how we do things locally to decarbonize our electricity, decarbonize our heat and so on. Eventually that will come to a crunch point, which is, well, we're depending less upon the local networks. So who's going to pay for the local and the national networks? To me, the answer back comes, it's the flexibility question, in that, well, if smart local energy systems become flexible, they offer value back to the networks that avoids reinforcement costs and so on. So I think this comment of well, there's sort of levels of smartness in the way that heat's incorporated into local energy systems. Yeah, it's about having a number of solutions brought together, then trying to integrate them, then trying to make them smart. So I'm slightly conscious of time, so I'm looking through some of the questions that we've got. There is this question about, well, okay, shifting costs from electricity to gas. Should you shift it from electricity to gas, or should you just shift it back to the government? That's more the sort of, has anybody got any views about general taxation versus targeted measures?
Have you seen, Public First did quite a nice report with a whole bunch of industry, I think last year. And I think what I liked about that report is that I think it goes through relatively quite systematically, actually, in terms of the different ways in which you could do that, and the different impacts where you get to in terms of both an average dual fuel bill as well as for those who are in fuel poverty. I think what they found, and what others have found as well, is that this straight electricity to gas is not good in terms of distributional impacts. It is too simplistic a way of thinking about that problem. Where they went on the Public First side, which I think is supported by others, is that it would be much better from a distributional impact side if you actually moved quite a lot of those levies onto general taxation, but then you start to increase a more specific approach to carbon pricing on the domestic gas side.
Can I also ask you, Caroline, to sort of comment on another one? So we've had the comment raised that, well, just shifting from gas to electricity costs are likely to be going up. And also you have all the network reinforcement costs to get more electricity if it's going to take over from the use of gas and so on. To me, this is actually going to this question of, the heat pumps versus heat networks and so on discussion. So, have you got a sort of view from the ADE about this proposition that says, well, if you're going to decarbonize heat, then sometimes you'll be using individual heat pumps, sometimes you'll be using big heat pumps attached to heat networks and so on. How do you see that evolving?
I mean, I think it's still to be worked out, isn't it? But in a broad brush way, I guess, when you look at some of the work that's coming out of BEIS at the minute, and actually the CCC and others, you're looking at, especially for heat networks, a cost-effective share, I guess, of total heating demand that sits at about 20%, and consistently it's kind of got to about 20% when they do these types of models. I think when you look at that more generally, then, in terms of, for example, where ground source heat pumps might be a cost-effective option, but are still a more sort of dwelling level solution in some cases, that gets you a bit further, actually, probably into that demand, with air source heat pumps making up the vast majority, as far as we see it, in terms of the remainder. I think the question, obviously, of hydrogen for heating is one that's very live right now and is quite controversial. I guess I think there's something very interesting about, especially on our side, if you're going to be using hydrogen, particularly in high temperature processes within industrial clusters, whether you actually start to get this overlapping of really good areas for heat networks with using that industrial heat. So you effectively start to have kind of hydrogen-led heat networks in some areas, but probably a more minor part.
So I'm slightly conscious of the time. So what I suggest that I do, I hope I've covered a lot of the questions that people have put up, is if I try and draw together some thoughts, but then, you know, invite the panel to sort of reflect on those and so on. I mean, it's been a fascinating task looking at this question of heat and the role it plays in smart local energy systems. It's drawn out this thing of, well, a local approach, but I think what we've just talked about today is, yeah, well, okay, that's nice and easy to say, but who and where? I'm going to put a sort of provocative comment in that we now know a lot more about smart local energy systems through the PIFA program, and I think there's some really good opportunities there to take those forward as demonstrators as they're intended, in terms of, well, this is what happens if you incorporate heat into a smart local energy system and try and make it flexible. It does talk about the way that, you know, you have to have the empowered local actors. Yeah, it's not just local authorities, it's the local businesses, whether you want to call that, you know, regional energy hubs and so on. So there's the evolving sort of structure that says, well, okay, we'll do something local, and I suppose I'm plugging, saying, you know, we're getting examples of that in terms of smart local energy systems. So a regional energy hub is a smart local energy system, I suppose. We've sort of looked for a fresh balance between regulated standards, behavioural incentives and commercial incentives. So, you know, it is, perhaps this is your bold thinking or radical thinking, is, yeah, we've got to sort of knock some of this stuff away. You know, yes, it's good news that we're going to start looking at how heat networks might need to be regulated. But if we take that down the path of competition and choice, that's going to be painful. And so we need something radically different. And I think, you know, it goes back to this local thing, is that, you know, if you take the focus on smart local energy systems and how they address heat, you know, that is also addressing the, how do you build the skills, how do you address the jobs, how do you sort of build the supply chains. You know, if you just support 90,000 heat pumps dotted around the country, as has Maddie commented in previous attempts, you know, the whole thing sort of just gets diffuse. You need to actually sort of focus it. And that gives you the sort of smarter, more integrated approach that addresses the co-benefits, the social benefits, and so on. So that's a dream. Have the panelists got any sort of comments to add to that?
Because maybe if I go first very briefly, I guess final reflection is, I'm not sure whether people saw, but there was a select committee report that was published maybe last week or something.
Yeah,
like
it's a good one.
Yes, exactly. That looked into the decarbonisation of heat. I think the one thing I wanted to bring up, there was so much to that report, but I found sad but enlightening further, the special criticism that DLUC came into within that report. For those who haven't seen it, they invited the minister to give evidence on decarbonising heat in homes, and the DLUC minister basically said, we don't do that, talk to someone else, which I think was quite, you know, we knew that, but to have it in such black and white terms was quite startling. And I think where that gets you to, doesn't it, is there's got to be another way. And I think for me personally, getting to a point where really massive private investment can come through into local areas, because we've got the right infrastructure planning, the right structures in terms of markets and stable policy at that local level, is the thing that we really need to do to get this moving.
Jeff and Maddie?
I think for me, it's really important, I think, to me, that we're delivering more than just carbon reductions with this heat transformation. So although this sort of urgency that's kind of underpinning all of this action is carbon related, there's a much bigger equality issue here. Even before the current energy crisis, we had 4 million people in fuel poverty. That number is about to go up to by 50%. Potentially, and the impacts of living in fuel poverty are just dire. Basically, I mean, the stats on kind of the excess winter deaths are 17,000 living in cold homes, 5,500 of living in fuel poverty, and so we don't just need to decarbonise the heat sector. And I think I worry that these top-down approaches are mostly thinking about that, whereas a smart and local approach, as we've talked about, could give agency to localities, to regions, to identify what their priorities are, where their strengths are, what support they can give. And we can capture all of these benefits, like alleviating fuel poverty, improving local air quality, improving the health and comfort, and providing loads of jobs where they are desperately needed at the moment. And so I think for me, that's where the real opportunity for a SLES approach to heat decarbonisation lies.
And Jeff?
Yeah, well, I'll be really quick because we're there, aren't we, on time? So I said up front, this is a wicked problem. It's really complex, and you can't solve a wicked problem with simple solutions. You need complex solutions, and the best place to manage those complex solutions is locally where they arise, where you can have someone who can, like a group of people who can discuss it together with the citizens of that place, the business of that place, and agree to the right solution, and then put in place a complex but right set of things for that place, for that heat transition, for those people, for those businesses, for all of those other things. So I'm going to leave it there. It's wicked, so let's sort it out.
It's wicked, but worth going for. So I'll just sort of close out with a comment that says, thank you very much for everybody joining us. Do please follow the Energy Rev programs, because today I think has sort of identified the role that smart local energy systems play, and there'll be subsequent discussions around, well, okay, here's the evidence and here's the examples. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining. My great appreciation for our panelists, for the team, the whole team involved in producing the report. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your day.